The billionaire lay dying on the hospital floor while nurses stepped over him to help other patients. Hiroshi Tanaka owned the medical company that built half the equipment in this emergency room, but tonight he looked like just another homeless man, bleeding from a head wound. Only one person had stopped to help him on the rain-soaked Manhattan street, a restaurant worker who'd lost her job to save a stranger's life. If you've ever wondered whether kindness still matters when no one important is watching, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button so we don't lose each other, because this story will restore your faith in doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. The sidewalk outside Meridian Restaurant gleamed black under the October rain, each droplet catching the amber glow of streetlights like scattered coins. Maya Rodriguez pressed her face against the tall windows, watching the steady stream of well-dressed diners hurry past on Fifth Avenue, their umbrellas forming a moving canopy of expensive fabric. Inside the restaurant, the warmth felt artificial against the storm outside, all polished brass and soft jazz, insulating the wealthy from the harsh realities just beyond the glass. Maya's reflection stared back at her from the window, 28 years old, her dark hair pulled back in the regulation style, the crisp white shirt and black slacks of her uniform marking her as help, not clientele. She had been working the dinner rush for 6 hours straight, her feet aching in shoes she couldn't afford to replace, when she noticed the old man. He was shuffling along the sidewalk, bent against the wind, his thin jacket offering no protection against the driving rain. Maya watched as he stumbled, his body folding forward as if the weight of the storm had finally broken him. The sound hit her first, a sharp crack that seemed to echo inside her chest, the unmistakable noise of bone meeting concrete. Then came the silence that followed, more terrible than any scream, the awful absence of movement that made Maya's heart skip forward in her throat. She pressed her palms against the cold glass, watching the old man's body settle into stillness on the wet pavement. The rain continued its relentless drumming, but Maya could hear nothing except the blood rushing in her ears and her own sharp intake of breath. Something deep in her stomach twisted with recognition. This was how it started. How people disappeared from the world. Not with violence or drama, but with a simple fall and the turning away of eyes that didn't want to see. Around the fallen man, the city continued its relentless pace. A businessman in a charcoal coat stepped carefully around the body, pulling out his phone not to call for help, but to check his messages as he disappeared into the night. A young couple emerged from the restaurant's entrance, the woman gasping and clutching her partner's arm. But they quickly diverted their path and vanished into the warm interior of a taxi. The restaurant's security guard, a thick-set man Maya knew only as Peters, appeared in the doorway. He looked down at the injured man with the expression of someone who had just discovered an unwelcome mess on his clean floor. Instead of kneeling to help, Peters glanced around nervously, then stepped back inside, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him. Maya felt her stomach clench with a familiar rage. The same feeling she'd carried since childhood, watching her family navigate a world that seemed designed to overlook people who looked like them, sounded like them, needed help from them. She could hear her grandfather Miguel's voice in her memory, rough with years of construction work and cigarettes. The measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone is watching, but what they do when no one cares to look. Through the window, the old man's chest was barely moving, rising and falling in shallow movements that seemed to grow weaker with each passing second. Maya realized with growing horror that he might be dying right there on the sidewalk, while an entire city pretended not to see. She looked around the restaurant's dining room, where conversations continued over wine and appetizers, where no one seemed aware that a human being was suffering just feet from their warm, comfortable world. The maitre d' Vincent was seating a party of 6 at the window table, his practiced smile never wavering as he pointed out the charming street view. Maya's hands were shaking as she pulled her phone from her apron pocket. The rational part of her mind, the part that worried about rent and student loans and her mother's medical bills, whispered warnings about getting involved, about the consequences of abandoning her station during the busy dinner service. She had already been written up twice this month for minor infractions, and Vincent had made it clear that her job hung by a thread. But as she stared at the motionless figure outside, Maya felt something deeper than memory or training. This was the moment her grandfather had prepared her for, without knowing it, not through his words, but through his example. Every time he'd stopped to help a stranded motorist, every dollar he'd given to families whose children needed school supplies, every weekend he'd spent building wheelchair ramps for neighbors who couldn't afford them. He had shown her that being human meant refusing to walk past suffering even when it cost you everything. The old man's breathing was barely visible now, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular movements that seemed to grow weaker with each passing second. Maya's training from her volunteer work at the clinic kicked in. Head injuries were unpredictable, and exposure to cold rain could send someone into shock. Every minute mattered. She was already moving toward the door when Vincent's sharp voice cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Rodriguez, table 12 is still waiting for their wine." Maya paused, her hand on the brass door handle, feeling the weight of two worlds pulling her in opposite directions. Behind her was the safety of routine, the paycheck she desperately needed, the predictable rhythm of service that had kept her afloat for the past 2 years. Ahead of her, through the rain-streaked glass, was an old man whose life might depend on whether anyone chose to care. The door felt heavier than it should have as Maya pushed it open, the October wind hitting her face like a slap. The noise of the restaurant faded behind her, replaced by the harsh symphony of the storm, rain drumming against metal awnings, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the distant wail of sirens that seemed to be heading anywhere but here. Maya knelt beside the fallen man, her uniform immediately soaking through. Up close, she could see that he was Asian, probably in his 80s, with deeply lined hands and clothes that had seen better decades. There was something almost dignified about his face, even unconscious and injured, that reminded her of the older men in her grandfather's generation, men who had worked hard and asked for little and expected even less. "Sir," she said softly, checking for a pulse at his wrist. It was there, but weak and irregular. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Maya thought she heard him murmur something in what sounded like Japanese. She had studied the language in college, a minor that had seemed impractical at the time, but now felt like providence. "You're going to be okay," she said, then added hesitantly, "Daijoubu, daijoubu desu." "I'm okay." The old man's eyes opened fully, then dark, and surprisingly alert, despite his condition. When he saw Maya's face hovering over him when he heard her attempting his language, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition, as if he had been waiting his entire life for someone to see him as fully human. "Arigato," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you." Maya was already dialing 911 when she felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see Peters, the security guard, looming over her with an expression of barely contained irritation. "Miss Rodriguez, you need to get back inside. You're creating a disturbance." The absurdity of it hit her like a physical blow. "A disturbance? This man is bleeding and unconscious." "That's not our responsibility. The city will handle it." Maya looked around at the empty street, at the faces in the restaurant windows who had turned away the moment she'd stepped outside. "The city? You mean like all these people who've been handling it for the past 10 minutes? Peter's face hardened. "I'm telling you one last time, get back to work, or Mr. Vincent will hear about this." But Maya was already talking to the emergency dispatcher, giving their location and describing the old man's condition with the clinical precision she'd learned during her graduate work. She could feel Peters standing over her, radiating disapproval, but she had crossed a line now that couldn't be uncrossed. As she waited for the ambulance, Maya held the old man's hand and spoke to him in the mixture of English and basic Japanese she could manage. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so frail, and she found herself thinking about all the hands that had held hers over the years, her mother's hands teaching her to fold empanadas, her grandfather's calloused palms when he taught her to change a tire, the hands of professors and mentors who had believed in her potential even when she couldn't afford to believe in it herself. The old man Hiroshi, he had managed to tell her, squeezed her fingers when the ambulance finally arrived, its red and blue lights painting the rain-soaked street in urgent colors. As the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, he kept his eyes fixed on Maya's face, as if memorizing it. "Ma'am, are you family?" one of the EMTs asked. Maya hesitated. The smart thing would be to say no, to step back and let the system take over, to return to her station and hope Vincent didn't dock her pay for the interruption. But something in Hiroshi's eyes, a kind of quiet desperation that spoke of too many years of being invisible, made the decision for her. "I'm coming with him," she said, climbing into the ambulance before anyone could object. As the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away from the restaurant, Maya caught a glimpse of Vincent's face in the window, his expression promising consequences she wasn't ready to think about. But beside her, Hiroshi was breathing steadier now, his color returning slightly, and Maya knew with absolute certainty that she had made the only choice her grandfather would have understood. The ambulance raced through the rain-dark streets of Manhattan, its siren cutting through the urban noise like a prayer for mercy in a city that had forgotten how to listen. The fluorescent lights of St. Vincent's Hospital emergency room buzzed with the same harsh intensity Maya remembered from her volunteer shifts 3 years ago, when she'd still believed her master's degree in social work would lead to something more meaningful than serving overpriced wine to people who treated her like furniture. She sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Hiroshi's gurney, watching the triage nurse flip through paperwork with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped seeing patients as people. Maya's clothes were still damp from the rain, her restaurant uniform marking her as someone who didn't belong in this sterile world of medical authority. But she had spent enough time in hospitals, first as a volunteer, then during her practicum at Presbyterian, and finally during her mother's long battle with diabetes, to recognize the signs of institutional indifference. "Name?" the nurse asked, not looking up from her clipboard. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and Maya noticed the way she kept glancing between her computer screen and the growing line of patients behind them. The nurse's badge was crooked, her scrubs wrinkled, and there was a coffee stain on her sleeve that spoke of someone deep into a double shift. "Hiroshi Tanaka," Maya answered when the old man didn't respond immediately. "Relationship to patient." Maya hesitated. I found him. He was injured outside my workplace." The nurse finally looked up, her eyes taking in Maya's uniform with a flicker of dismissal. Behind Maya, someone was coughing violently, and she could hear 2 other nurses calling for assistance with different patients. The triage desk phone was ringing incessantly. "Are you family?" "No, but..." "Then you need to wait in the family area. This is a restricted zone." Maya felt the familiar clench of frustration in her chest, the same feeling she'd carried through 4 years at Columbia, watching professors defer to her wealthier classmates while her own insights were politely ignored. She had graduated summa cum laude with a master's in social work, had spent a summer in Geneva, working with the United Nations Refugee Resettlement Program, and had volunteered with Doctors Without Borders during their stateside training program. But none of that showed on her face. None of it was visible in her accent or her uniform, or the fact that she was sitting in an emergency room with an elderly Japanese man she'd met 20 minutes ago. "Actually," Maya said, switching to the tone she'd learned in graduate school, professional, informed, impossible to dismiss. "I'm a licensed social worker. I have experience with emergency medical protocols, and I speak some Japanese. Mr. Tanaka may need translation assistance." The nurse's eyebrows rose slightly, but before she could respond, her pager buzzed insistently, and another nurse appeared at her shoulder with an urgent question about bed assignments. Maya watched the chaos swirling around the understaffed station phones, ringing computers, beeping patients, calling out in 3 different languages. "Fine," the nurse said, making a quick notation without looking up. "But if his condition changes, you'll need to step back." Maya nodded, recognizing the bureaucratic compromise of an overworked system. The nurse was juggling too many crises to verify credentials, and Maya was offering to solve one problem by keeping a non-English speaker calm and informed. It wasn't ideal, but it was human. Maya settled back into the chair beside Hiroshi's bed. The old man's eyes were closed, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the thin hospital blanket. She had seen that same look on her grandfather's face during his final hospitalization, the expression of someone who understood they were completely dependent on the mercy of strangers. "Hiroshi-san," she said softly, using the respectful form of address she remembered from her college classes. Watashi, Maya. I'm staying with you." His eyes opened, focusing on her face with what looked like surprise. "You..." Speak Japanese? Sukoshi. Little bit, Maya said, holding up her thumb and forefinger to show a small space. She was conscious of how awkwardly the words sat in her mouth, how her pronunciation probably sounded clumsy to his ears. College, daigaku de, studied. Hiroshi's expression softened at her halting attempt the way someone might look at a child carefully sounding out words in a picture book. There was kindness in his eyes, but also something else, a recognition of effort over fluency that spoke to someone who understood the courage it took to try. You're Japanese. Very careful, he said gently. Like my English when I first came here. You try to honor my language. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. Is it okay? Not too terrible? It is terrible, Hiroshi said with what might have been a small smile. But perfectly terrible with respect. That matters more than perfect words. Before Maya could respond, a doctor appeared at the foot of the bed, young, tired-looking, with the kind of practiced indifference that Maya recognized from her hospital volunteer work. He glanced at Hiroshi's chart, then at Maya. Are you family? I'm his social worker, Maya said, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. It wasn't exactly a lie she was a social worker, and Hiroshi clearly needed one. The doctor nodded absently. Head CT shows a minor concussion, no skull fracture. We'll need to keep him for observation, but... He paused, checking his tablet. There's no insurance information on file. Does he have coverage? Maya looked at Hiroshi, who had closed his eyes again. His clothes were old but clean, his hands weathered but not dirty. She thought about the hundreds of homeless patients she'd worked with during her practicum, about the subtle signs that separated the chronically homeless from the temporarily displaced. We're still gathering his information, Maya said carefully. But under EMTALA, you're required to provide emergency care regardless of insurance status. The doctor's expression shifted slightly. Are you familiar with the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act? I am. I'm also familiar with the hospital's obligations under Medicaid emergency coverage provisions. Maya kept her voice level, professional. Mr. Tanaka has suffered a head injury with temporary loss of consciousness. That qualifies as an emergency medical condition requiring stabilization. The doctor looked at her more carefully now, taking in not just the restaurant uniform, but the way she spoke, the confidence in her posture. What kind of social worker are you? The kind who knows when patients are getting substandard care because of assumptions about their ability to pay. Maya stood up, making herself taller, more authoritative. I'd like to speak with your social services department about Mr. Tanaka's case. That won't be necessary, the doctor said quickly. We'll run the standard protocols. Someone will be up for admission within the hour. As the doctor hurried away, Maya felt a hand touch her arm. Hiroshi was looking at her with something that might have been admiration. You are not just a social worker, he said quietly. You are someone who fights. Maya thought about her student loans, $63,000, that felt like a weight she carried everywhere. She thought about the restaurant job she'd probably lost by leaving in the middle of the dinner rush. She thought about her mother's medical bills and the rent check she still needed to write and the phone calls from creditors that she'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. Sometimes fighting is all we have, she said. Hiroshi was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those sharp, dark eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange weight, as if he were testing something fragile and precious. Your family. They came from Mexico. Yes, I can hear the music of Spanish under your English. My grandfather came from Guadalajara in 1968, Maya said. He used to say the important thing wasn't where you came from, but whether you recognized the humanity in people who needed help. Something shifted in Hiroshi's expression, a sudden stilling, as if Maya had spoken a password he'd been waiting 50 years to hear. His breathing became shallow, and she watched his knuckles go white as he gripped the blanket. Your grandfather, he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very careful. What was his name? Miguel Rodriguez. Why? The blood seemed to drain from Hiroshi's face. His eyes went wide with what looked like recognition, then immediately darkened with something that might have been fear or guilt. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. Miguel Rodriguez, he repeated, and Maya heard something in those words that made her skin prickle. Tell me, did he ever speak of helping a young Japanese man long ago? Maya's heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't say why. He helped lots of people. He said it was just what you did. You saw someone who needed help. You helped them. Why did you? Do you know someone he helped? Hiroshi's eyes closed, and for a moment Maya thought he might have lost consciousness again. But then she saw a single tear slide down his weathered cheek, and she realized she was watching a man confront a ghost he thought he'd left behind decades ago. Maya-san, he said, finally, his voice thick with emotion she couldn't identify. If they ask about Miguel Rodriguez, if anyone asks about him or about me, you must promise you will be very, very careful. The warning settled over Maya like a shadow, carrying implications she couldn't yet grasp. Before she could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted from the nurse's station. She could hear raised voices, someone demanding to know who had authorized an uninsured patient's admission without proper documentation. Hiroshi-san, she said quickly, do you have anyone I can call? Any family? The old man's eyes met hers, and Maya saw something that looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. No family, he said. Only you. And Maya-san. His hand found hers, gripping it with surprising strength. Your grandfather was a very good man. Perhaps too good for this world. You have his heart, I think, but hearts like that, they can be dangerous. Maya spent the night in the hard plastic chair beside Hiroshi's bed, watching the slow rotation of nurses and orderlies who moved through the emergency room with the efficient indifference of people who had learned to ration their compassion. Every few hours, someone would appear with a clipboard asking the same questions about insurance, and next of kin, their expressions growing more skeptical each time Maya explained that she was still gathering information. By dawn, her back ached, and her uniform was wrinkled beyond recognition, but Hiroshi's breathing had steadied, and the color had returned to his weathered face. She had dozed fitfully in the chair, waking each time his monitors beeped or when she heard footsteps approaching their corner of the emergency bay. The hospital felt like a fortress under siege, with Maya and Hiroshi occupying disputed territory that could be reclaimed at any moment by forces they couldn't control. The morning shift brought new faces and renewed bureaucratic pressure. Maya was sipping lukewarm coffee from a vending machine cup when Dr. Patricia Hendricks appeared, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of bearing that suggested she had spent decades fighting battles in hospital corridors. She carried herself with the authority of someone who made decisions that mattered. And when she looked at Maya, her expression was calculating rather than dismissive. Maya had encountered administrators like her during her practicum, people who understood that hospitals were businesses first and places of healing second, who had learned to navigate the complex mathematics of profit margins and liability exposure. Dr. Hendricks reviewed Hiroshi's chart with the thoroughness of someone looking for problems, and Maya felt her stomach tighten as she watched the administrator's frown deepen with each page. Miss Rodriguez, Dr. Hendricks said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering bad news. I understand you've been serving as Mr. Tanaka's advocate, but I'm afraid we have some concerns about his continued care here. Without proper insurance verification or family contact, our ability to provide extended treatment is limited. We've stabilized his condition, which fulfills our emergency care obligations, but anything beyond that requires proper authorization and payment arrangements. Maya felt the familiar surge of anger that came from watching institutions prioritize paperwork over people, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the moment her graduate training had prepared her for the intersection of human need and bureaucratic machinery, where advocates either succeeded or failed based on their knowledge of the system's pressure points. She thought about the refugee families she had worked with in Geneva, how a single form or properly cited regulation could mean the difference between safety and deportation. Dr. Hendricks, Maya said, standing to make herself equal in height to the administrator. I need to clarify something about EMTALA requirements. A patient who has suffered head trauma with altered consciousness can't be discharged until a physician determines they're medically stable for discharge. Mr. Tanaka is 82 years old, was found unconscious on a city street, and has no safe discharge plan. Releasing him without proper assessment would constitute patient dumping under federal law, which carries penalties of up to $50,000 per violation. Maya watched Dr. Hendricks' expression shift as the legal implications sank in. This wasn't a conversation about charity care anymore. It was about regulatory compliance and institutional liability. Maya had learned during her hospital volunteer work that administrators respected two things above all others: legal requirements and financial consequences. Everything else was negotiable, but federal law was carved in stone, and violations could trigger investigations that no hospital administrator wanted to face. Dr. Hendricks reviewed the chart again, this time with visible tension around her eyes. "You seem unusually well informed about hospital regulations for a restaurant worker," she said, and Maya heard the question underneath the observation. Maya had been waiting for this moment, the point where she would have to reveal enough of her background to establish credibility, without losing the element of surprise that came from being underestimated. She thought about all the times professors had called on her wealthy classmates, first assuming that their answers would be more insightful, only to discover that Maya had done twice the research and understood the material at a deeper level. The trick was knowing when to show your cards, and when to keep them hidden, when to demand respect, and when to let people underestimate you until it was too late for them to recover. "I have a master's degree in social work from Columbia," Maya said quietly. "I specialized in healthcare advocacy and medical social work. I'm currently working in food service to pay off student loans, but my training is in exactly this kind of situation." She pulled out her wallet and showed Dr. Hendricks her degree verification card, the same one she had shown the night nurse, but with more confidence this time. "I've worked with Doctors Without Borders on patient advocacy protocols, and I spent a summer at the UN working on refugee healthcare access. I know what medical abandonment looks like, and I know what the legal consequences are for institutions that practice it." Dr. Hendricks studied the card with the attention of someone reassessing a situation that had suddenly become more complicated. Maya could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the recognition that this wasn't going to be as simple as pressuring a confused family member into taking an unwanted patient home. "I see," Dr. Hendricks said finally. "And what exactly are you proposing as a discharge plan for Mr. Tanaka?" Maya had been preparing for this question since 3 in the morning, when she had used the hospital's Wi-Fi to research city services and housing options for elderly patients without family support. She had called her former supervisor at Presbyterian during her coffee break and gotten the names of 3 social service agencies that specialized in emergency placement for vulnerable adults. This was the part of advocacy work that most people never saw: the hours of research and phone calls and form filling that happened behind the scenes, the careful construction of safety nets for people who had fallen through the cracks. Maya had learned during her practicum that good social work was equal parts compassion and logistics, that saving someone's life often came down to knowing which forms to file and which bureaucrat to call. "I've contacted Adult Protective Services and arranged for an emergency assessment," Maya said, pulling out her phone to show the confirmation email. "I've also reached out to the Japanese Cultural Center to see if they have translation services or community connections that might help us locate family members. Additionally, I've identified 3 transitional housing facilities that accept emergency placements for elderly patients pending insurance verification." She had made most of these calls from the hospital bathroom, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing other patients, but the groundwork was solid. Maya had learned that the key to winning battles with hospital administrators was to come prepared with solutions, not just complaints. Bureaucrats could ignore moral arguments, but they couldn't ignore concrete plans that protected the institution from liability while providing appropriate patient care. Dr. Hendricks looked genuinely surprised. "You've done all this overnight?" Maya nodded, feeling the exhaustion in her bones, but also the satisfaction that came from outmaneuvering a system designed to exclude people like her. This was what her grandfather had taught her, without words, that competence was a form of dignity, that knowing how to fight back was as important as choosing to fight. She thought about Miguel Rodriguez learning enough English to argue with foremen who tried to shortchange his crew, about her mother mastering the Byzantine requirements of the Medicaid system to ensure Maya's childhood health care was covered. They had taught her that intelligence was a weapon that couldn't be taken away, that preparation could level playing fields that seemed hopelessly tilted. I have, Maya said. And I'll continue working on placement options until we find something appropriate. But Mr. Tanaka isn't leaving this hospital until he's medically cleared and has a safe place to go. Dr. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, and Maya could see her weighing options that all seemed to lead back to the same conclusion that this particular fight wasn't worth the institutional risk. Maya had learned during her advocacy training that most battles were won not through dramatic confrontations but through patient application of pressure at exactly the right points. Bureaucracies were like rivers, they always followed the path of least resistance, and Maya had just made resistance very expensive. Very well, Dr. Hendricks said finally. We'll continue Mr. Tanaka's care pending resolution of his placement, but I'll need documentation of your advocacy credentials and a formal care plan within 24 hours. Maya felt a surge of triumph, but she kept her expression professional. This was a victory, but it was also just the beginning. She had bought them time, but time was meaningless without a plan to use it effectively. As Dr. Hendricks walked away, Maya turned back to Hiroshi's bed and found him watching her with eyes that seemed to hold depths she was only beginning to understand. You fought for me, he said quietly, like Miguel would have done. Maya felt something shift in her chest at the way he said her grandfather's name with a familiarity that suggested knowledge rather than assumption. But before she could ask what he meant, a new voice interrupted from behind her. Maya turned to find a security guard she didn't recognize, a younger man with the kind of eager authority that suggested he was new to the job and determined to prove himself. His uniform was crisp and his radio crackled with official importance. And when he looked at Maya, she saw the particular blend of suspicion and dismissal that she had learned to recognize in people who had been given small amounts of power and took them very seriously. Ma'am, I need to ask you to come with me. The guard said, his hand resting casually on his belt where his radio and other equipment created an impressive display of authority. There are some questions about your relationship to this patient and your authorization to be in this restricted area. Maya felt her heart sink as she realized that Dr. Hendricks' retreat had been tactical rather than permanent. The administrator had simply changed strategies, choosing to address the problem through security rather than direct confrontation. This was how institutions protected themselves when legal arguments failed. They found procedural violations and used them to remove troublesome advocates. Maya had seen it happen during her practicum, watched families separated from patients because someone had decided their presence was disruptive to hospital operations. The security office smelled like stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the metal desk where Maya sat facing three people who held her immediate future in their hands. Security Chief Ramon Martinez was a thick-set man in his 50s whose weathered face suggested years of dealing with hospital crises that ranged from confused dementia patients to grieving families who couldn't accept bad news. Beside him sat Dr. Hendricks, her expression carefully neutral, and a younger woman Maya didn't recognize who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh from Human Resources. The room felt deliberately intimidating with its concrete walls and lack of windows designed to make people feel small and isolated from the normal world of patient care happening just outside the door. Maya forced herself to sit straight in the uncomfortable metal chair, remembering her grandfather's advice about never letting anyone see you break even when you felt like you were drowning. Miss Rodriguez. Chief Martinez began consulting a file that seemed surprisingly thick for someone who had been in the hospital less than 24 hours. We've received some concerning information about your presence here. Our records show you arrived with Mr. Tanaka claiming to be a social worker, but your employer identification shows you as an employee of Meridian Restaurant. Can you explain this discrepancy? Maya felt the careful architecture of her advocacy crumbling around her as she realized how quickly institutions could mobilize when they wanted someone gone. They had called Meridian, probably spoken to Vincent, gathered enough information to build a case that she was some kind of fraud or con artist preying on vulnerable patients. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being investigated for helping someone, while the hospital had spent hours trying to find ways to abandon the same patient without legal consequences. I'm a licensed social worker, Maya said, keeping her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. I have a master's degree from Columbia and valid credentials. I'm currently working in food service to pay off student loans, but that doesn't invalidate my professional training or my right to advocate for a patient who has no other representation. She reached for her purse to pull out her credential verification, but Jennifer Walsh held up a hand to stop her. The HR representative was younger than Maya, probably fresh out of college with a business degree and no understanding of the complex realities that forced overqualified people into survival jobs. Maya could see in her eyes the particular kind of judgment that came from people who had never had to choose between their career ideals and their rent payment. "We've already verified your educational background," Walsh said, her tone suggesting that this was somehow evidence against Maya rather than in her favor. "But we're concerned about your motives here. You have no family relationship to Mr. Tanaka, no professional authorization to act on his behalf, and no institutional affiliation that would justify your continued presence in our facility. Additionally, we understand that you abandoned your workplace last night without permission, which raises questions about your judgment and reliability." Maya felt the walls closing in as she realized that her attempt to help Hiroshi was being reframed as evidence of instability or deception. This was how the system protected itself, by making advocates the problem, rather than addressing the underlying issues that made advocacy necessary. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward, her expression suggesting sympathetic concern that Maya immediately recognized as performative. "Miss Rodriguez, we appreciate your compassion for Mr. Tanaka. But we have protocols for a reason. Unauthorized individuals can't simply decide to take responsibility for patients regardless of their good intentions. We have professional social workers on staff who are qualified to handle cases like this through proper channels." Maya wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. The same hospital that had spent hours looking for ways to discharge an injured elderly man was now lecturing her about proper procedures for patient care. She thought about the night nurse who had been too exhausted to verify credentials, about Dr. Hendricks's initial attempts to push Hiroshi out the door, about the systematic indifference that would have left him bleeding on the sidewalk if Maya hadn't intervened. "Your professional social workers weren't here last night," Maya said, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. "Your staff was discussing discharge plans for a patient with a head injury based on insurance status rather than medical need. If I hadn't advocated for proper care, Mr. Tanaka would have been dumped back on the street in violation of federal law." She could feel her professional composure slipping as the exhaustion and frustration of the past 12 hours caught up with her. This was the moment her professors had warned her about, when the gap between advocacy and self-preservation became impossible to bridge, when standing up for others meant risking everything you had worked to build. Chief Martinez's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Rodriguez. Are you claiming that our medical staff violated patient care standards?" Maya realized she had walked into a trap. Any specific criticism of hospital procedures could be characterized as defamation, giving them legal grounds to remove her while protecting themselves from the broader implications of her presence. She had seen this tactic used against whistleblowers during her training, the way institutions turned advocacy into a liability, by forcing advocates to choose between protecting patients and protecting themselves. The system was designed to exhaust people like her, to make the cost of fighting so high that most people eventually gave up and walked away. "I'm stating facts about what I observed," Maya said carefully, "and I'm exercising my rights as a citizen to ensure that an elderly man receives appropriate care." But even as she spoke, Maya could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Through the office window, she could see the normal flow of hospital life continuing, patients being wheeled past on gurneys, families clutching coffee cups and waiting for news, medical staff moving with the purposeful efficiency of people whose authority was never questioned. She thought about Hiroshi lying in his hospital bed, probably wondering where she had gone, possibly assuming that she had abandoned him like everyone else. The thought made her stomach clench with guilt and determination in equal measure. Jennifer Walsh consulted her tablet with the satisfied expression of someone delivering a winning argument. "Miss Rodriguez, we've also been informed that you no longer have employment at Meridian Restaurant as of last night. This raises additional questions about your stability and your ability to follow through on any commitments you might make regarding Mr. Tanaka's care." Maya felt the last pillar of her carefully constructed defense collapse as she realized that Vincent had probably called the hospital himself, eager to distance the restaurant from any liability that might arise from her involvement with Hiroshi. She thought about her rent due in 10 days, about her mother's diabetes medications that cost $300 a month, about the student loan payments that would resume, regardless of whether she had income to cover them. The silence in the room stretched like a held breath as Maya confronted the mathematics of her situation. She had approximately $800 in her checking account, no job, and a $63,000 debt that would follow her for decades. Her mother was depending on the money Maya sent home each month to cover medical expenses that Medicare didn't handle, and her own health insurance was tied to the restaurant job she had just lost. She could feel the weight of practical reality pressing down on her idealistic impulses, the same pressure that forced millions of people to turn away from suffering because they couldn't afford the luxury of moral consistency. This was how the system won, not through dramatic confrontations, but through the steady accumulation of financial pressure that made heroism impossible for anyone who wasn't already wealthy. "I understand your position," Maya said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't just walk away from him. He has no one else." Chief Martinez's expression softened slightly, and Maya caught a glimpse of someone who had probably started his career wanting to help people before learning that institutions required different priorities. Dr. Hendricks was checking her phone with the distracted air of someone who had already moved on to other problems, and Jennifer Walsh was organizing her papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had successfully resolved a personnel issue. Maya realized that for them, this was just another day at the office, a minor disruption quickly contained through proper procedures. "Miss Rodriguez," Chief Martinez said gently, "you've done more than most people would have done. Sometimes caring means recognizing when you're in over your head and trusting the system to take care of things." Maya wanted to ask him how long he had been telling himself that lie. How many times he had watched the system fail people who needed help while convincing himself that proper procedures were more important than human outcomes. But she could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what he was saying, that he had made peace with the compromises required to survive in institutional settings where compassion was a luxury that couldn't be afforded too often. As Maya stood to leave the security office, she felt something inside her chest crack like ice under pressure. She thought about her grandfather Miguel, who had never walked away from someone who needed help even when it cost him jobs or money or the respect of people who thought he was naive for caring about strangers. She thought about the refugee families she had worked with in Geneva, who had trusted her to navigate systems that could mean the difference between life and death, who had believed that someone would fight for them even when they had no power to demand it. She thought about Hiroshi lying in his hospital bed, probably understanding by now that he was alone again in a world that had no patience for inconvenient compassion. The walk back to Hiroshi's bedside felt like crossing a desert, each step requiring a conscious decision to continue moving forward. Maya could feel the eyes of hospital staff following her with the particular attention paid to problems that hadn't been completely resolved, people who might cause trouble if not carefully monitored. When she reached his bed, Hiroshi was awake and watching her approach with eyes that seemed to understand everything before she said a word. His weathered hands were folded on top of the white blanket, and Maya noticed how small he looked in the institutional bed, how the hospital gown dwarfed his thin frame and made him appear more fragile than he had on the rain-soaked sidewalk where she had first found him. "They told you to leave," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Maya sank into the plastic chair beside his bed, feeling the exhaustion of the past 24 hours settle into her bones like lead. She wanted to lie to tell him that everything was going to be fine, that the system would take care of him once she was gone. But looking into his dark eyes, she couldn't bring herself to add another layer of abandonment to what he had already experienced. Hiroshi deserved honesty, even if it was the only thing she had left to give him. "I'm sorry," Maya said, and the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she was apologizing for. "I tried. I really tried." Hiroshi's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift in his eyes, not surprise or anger, but a kind of weary recognition that suggested he had been expecting this moment all along. He reached out and took her hand in his skin warm and surprisingly steady despite everything that had happened. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned not to expect miracles, but still felt grateful when they appeared, however briefly. "You did more than anyone else would have done," Hiroshi said, echoing Chief Martinez's words, but with a gentleness that made them sound like blessing rather than dismissal. "You stayed with me when no one else would stay. You fought for me when no one else would fight. That matters more than you know." Maya felt tears burning behind her eyes as she realized that this was how it ended, not with victory or defeat, but with the quiet recognition that sometimes caring was enough, even when it couldn't change the outcome. She thought about all the people her grandfather had helped over the years, wondering how many of them had thanked him for trying, even when he couldn't save them from the larger forces that shaped their lives. "Hiroshi," Maya said, squeezing his hand, "there's something I need to tell you, something about my grandfather." But before she could continue, she heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Dr. Hendricks returning with what appeared to be a security escort. Maya felt her stomach drop as she realized that her time was up, that whatever connection existed between Hiroshi and her grandfather would have to remain unexplored. Another mystery buried under the weight of institutional procedures and bureaucratic necessity. Maya stood up slowly as Dr. Hendricks approached with the security escort, her mind racing through possibilities for extending this conversation just a few more minutes. But before the administrator could speak, Hiroshi's hand tightened around Maya's fingers with surprising strength, and she heard him whisper something that made her blood run cold. "The watch," he said so quietly that only she could hear. "In my jacket pocket. Look at the watch." Maya glanced toward the small closet where Hiroshi's rain-soaked clothes had been stored, then back at his face, which had gone pale with what looked like fear. Dr. Hendricks was close enough now that Maya could hear her heels clicking on the linoleum floor, each step marking the countdown to the end of whatever chance they had to understand the connection that had been haunting both of them since the night before. "Miss Rodriguez," Dr. Hendricks said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had resolved difficult situations through the simple application of institutional pressure. "I'm afraid your visiting privileges have been revoked. Chief Martinez will escort you to the main entrance." Maya looked at Hiroshi, whose eyes were fixed on hers with an intensity that seemed to contain decades of unspoken history. She could see him struggling with some internal decision, weighing risks that she couldn't understand against possibilities that might never come again. The security chief stepped forward with the patient expression of someone accustomed to removing people who didn't want to leave, but Maya noticed that his hand wasn't on his radio. This was meant to be a quiet exit, not a dramatic confrontation. "Wait," Hiroshi said, his voice stronger than it had been since Maya found him on the sidewalk. "Please. There is something I must tell her before she goes." Maya stepped quickly to the closet and pulled out Hiroshi's jacket, a worn brown leather coat that had seen decades of wear, but was still carefully maintained. When Maya slipped her hand inside the right pocket, her fingers closed around something cold and heavy. The watch was unlike anything Maya had ever held, clearly expensive, but not flashy, with a weight that spoke of Swiss precision and a face that gleamed with subtle luxury. When Maya turned it over, she found an inscription that made her hands start to tremble. "To H.T. from Miguel Rodriguez, 1973. Kindness sees no borders." "Miguel Rodriguez," Maya whispered, and suddenly the strange conversation from the night before made terrible sense. "You knew him. You really knew him." Hiroshi nodded, his weathered face crumpling with emotion that looked like it had been held back for decades. Dr. Hendricks exchanged a quick look with Chief Martinez, calculating the fallout of this development and its implications for the hospital's liability. Maya realized that they were standing at the intersection of personal history and institutional procedure, and that whatever happened next would depend on how quickly they could navigate the bureaucratic implications of this revelation. 1973, Hiroshi said, his voice thick with memory. "I was 25 years old. Came to America with $200 and dreams that seemed impossible. Your grandfather found me sleeping in a construction site in Queens, gave me work when no one else would hire a Japanese man who barely spoke English. But more than work, he gave me dignity." Maya felt her world tilting as she tried to reconcile this image with the grandfather she had known, Miguel Rodriguez, who had told her stories about building bridges and fixing roofs, but had never mentioned saving the life of a young immigrant who had apparently become wealthy enough to own watches that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Dr. Hendricks cleared her throat with forced authority. "This is very touching, but it doesn't change the hospital's policies regarding patient advocacy and visitor authorization." But Maya could see uncertainty in the administrator's eyes, the recognition that this wasn't a simple case of an unstable person attaching herself to a vulnerable patient. The watch in Maya's hands represented something that couldn't be easily dismissed, a connection that predated the hospital's procedures and carried implications that might extend beyond their institutional authority. Hiroshi struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, his eyes fixed on Maya's face with an intensity that made everything else fade into background noise. "Maya-san, your grandfather saved my life in ways that went beyond giving me work. When I was attacked by men who said I didn't belong in America, Miguel found me bleeding in an alley and took me to his own home to recover. His wife, your grandmother, nursed me back to health without asking for payment or even my name. They fed me, sheltered me, and when I was strong enough to work, Miguel taught me about construction and helped me start my own small business." "But the watch," Maya said, looking down at the elegant timepiece. "Why did he give you a watch like this?" Hiroshi's smile was sad and beautiful, transforming his weathered face into something that reminded Maya of old photographs where people's eyes held depths that modern cameras couldn't capture. She could see him remembering not just events, but emotions, the particular gratitude that came from being saved by people who had no obligation to care about your survival. "I gave him the watch," Hiroshi said quietly, "when my business began to succeed, when I could finally afford to repay some small part of what your family had done for me. But Miguel would not take money. He said that kindness was not a loan to be repaid, but a gift to be passed forward. So I had the watch engraved and told him it was not payment, but a promise that I would remember what he taught me about seeing people as human beings rather than categories or problems." Maya felt tears burning behind her eyes as she understood the weight of what she was holding. This wasn't just a gift between friends, it was a covenant between generations, a physical reminder of the possibility that individuals could choose compassion over convenience. Maya looked from the watch to Hiroshi's face and felt something click into place. "The business you started," she said slowly, "it wasn't just successful, it was very successful." Hiroshi nodded, his expression confirming what Maya was beginning to suspect, but couldn't quite bring herself to believe. She thought about his clothes, worn but well made, about the way he spoke English, with the precision of someone who had spent decades in professional settings, about the strange mix of vulnerability and authority she had sensed in him from the beginning. Within 2 hours of Maya showing Dr. Hendricks the engraved watch, St. Vincent's Hospital had transformed from a place of bureaucratic indifference into something resembling a diplomatic reception. Maya sat in the visitor's chair beside Hiroshi's bed, watching in amazement as a steady stream of increasingly important people found reasons to visit their corner of the emergency room. First came Dr. Patricia Melendez, the hospital's chief of staff, who introduced herself with the careful deference of someone who had been hastily briefed on a situation that might affect the institution's reputation. Then arrived James Morrison, the hospital's director of development, whose presence suggested that someone had done research into Hiroshi's financial capacity and discovered numbers that commanded immediate attention. Dr. Melendez reviewed Hiroshi's chart with the thoroughness of someone who wanted to ensure that every detail of his care could withstand scrutiny from people who mattered. "Mr. Tanaka," she said, her voice carrying the warm professionalism of someone accustomed to dealing with VIP patients. "I want to personally apologize for any confusion about your treatment. We've arranged for you to be moved to a private room in our executive wing, and I'll be overseeing your care personally to ensure you receive the attention you deserve." Maya watched Hiroshi's reaction to this sudden upgrade, noting the way his expression remained carefully neutral despite what must have been a profound shift in how he was being perceived and treated. "That is very kind," Hiroshi said quietly. "But I think there has been some misunderstanding. I am not more deserving of good care today than I was yesterday when you were trying to discharge me." His words hung in the air like an accusation that nobody wanted to address, directly forcing the assembled medical staff to confront the implications of their sudden attention. Maya felt a surge of admiration for the way Hiroshi was handling this moment, not with anger or demands for vindication, but with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that his real test wasn't how they treated him now that they knew who he was, but whether they would acknowledge the moral failure of how they had treated him before. Morrison stepped forward with the practiced smoothness of someone whose job involved extracting donations from wealthy individuals. "Mr. Tanaka, we understand that you may have concerns about your experience here, and we'd like the opportunity to discuss how we might address those concerns in a way that benefits both you and our commitment to excellence in patient care." Maya recognized the language of damage control, the careful phrasing that acknowledged problems without admitting liability, that offered solutions without accepting blame. But Hiroshi wasn't looking at Morrison or Dr. Melendez. His attention was fixed on Maya, and she could see something in his eyes that looked like pride mixed with determination. "The person you should be apologizing to," he said, his voice growing stronger, "is Maya Rodriguez. She spent the night advocating for proper medical care when your staff was more concerned with insurance verification than patient welfare. She used her professional knowledge and personal time to ensure that I received treatment that should have been automatic. And this morning you threatened to have her removed from the hospital for doing what your own social work department should have been doing." Dr. Melendez looked genuinely uncomfortable now, her carefully prepared talking points clearly not designed for a conversation about advocacy and institutional responsibility. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, her tone suggesting that she was navigating unfamiliar territory, "we certainly appreciate your dedication to Mr. Tanaka's welfare. Perhaps we could discuss how your professional background might be better utilized within our hospital system." Maya recognized the offer for what it was, an attempt to convert a potential critic into an institutional ally to solve the problem of her presence by giving her a stake in defending the hospital's reputation. But before Maya could respond, Hiroshi held up his hand with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "Dr. Melendez, I think there is something you need to understand about my situation and my relationship with Miss Rodriguez. My name is Hiroshi Tanaka, and I am the chairman of Tanaka Industries. Perhaps you have heard of us. We build medical facilities throughout Asia and have recently been exploring opportunities for expansion into the American healthcare market." For a moment, the only sound was the soft mechanical beep of the heart monitor. Then Morrison's phone chimed with an incoming message, breaking the spell. Maya watched the color drain from Dr. Melendez's face as the implications of this revelation sank in. Morrison was frantically typing on his phone, probably looking up Tanaka Industries and discovering the kind of financial information that would make hospital development directors lose sleep over missed opportunities. Maya found herself thinking about the strange irony of the situation. Hiroshi had presumably been wealthy enough to command this kind of attention all along, but had chosen to experience the hospital's default level of care to see how they treated people who couldn't demand better. "Mr. Tanaka," Dr. Melendez said, her voice carefully controlled, "if you had identified yourself earlier, we could have avoided any misunderstandings about your care requirements." Maya heard the subtle shift in responsibility, the suggestion that Hiroshi himself was somehow to blame for not revealing his identity and enabling the hospital to treat him appropriately. It was the kind of institutional logic that Maya had encountered repeatedly during her advocacy work, the idea that people were responsible for advocating for themselves rather than institutions being responsible for providing consistent standards of care. Hiroshi's laugh was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the administrative doublespeak that filled the room. "Dr. Melendez, I believe you have identified the exact problem with your hospital's approach to patient care. You are suggesting that appropriate medical treatment should depend on a patient's ability to identify themselves as wealthy or influential. This means that every person who cannot make such claims receives substandard care as a matter of policy." Maya watched the medical staff exchange glances as they realized that Hiroshi wasn't just complaining about his individual treatment, but challenging the fundamental assumptions that governed how their institution allocated attention and resources. The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Melendez's careful attempt to salvage what she could from a situation that had clearly moved beyond her control. Your sister, Tanika, we would very much like the opportunity to discuss your evaluation process and how St. Vincent's might better align with international standards of patient care excellence. Maya could hear the desperation beneath the professional language, the recognition that Hiroshi held power that could affect the careers and reputations of everyone in the room. Hiroshi looked at Maya and she saw something in his eyes that looked like a question waiting for an answer. Dr. Melendez, he said finally, my evaluation of St. Vincent's Hospital will depend entirely on how you address the systemic issues that Ms. Rodriguez identified during her advocacy for my care. She demonstrated the kind of patient-centered approach that international healthcare standards require, and she did so despite institutional resistance rather than institutional support. If you are serious about excellence in patient care, you will need to understand why your system failed and what changes are necessary to ensure it doesn't fail again. Maya felt something shift in her chest as she watched the administrators scramble to reposition themselves around Hiroshi's demands. For the first time since she'd knelt beside him on that rain-soaked sidewalk, the system was forced to listen. 6 months later, Maya stood in the conference room on the 32nd floor of the Chrysler Building looking out at Manhattan where her story with Hiroshi had begun. She wore a charcoal gray suit that fit properly for the first time in her adult life. Her student loans finally paid off after months of consulting fees from what Hiroshi called the St. Vincent's Project. The project had been a challenge. Could Maya design and implement a pilot program that would prevent the systematic discrimination they had both experienced? Hiroshi had given her $2 million and 6 months to prove institutional change was possible. Maya approached the task with methodical precision, spending the first month interviewing patients, families, and hospital staff to map where bias and bureaucracy intersected to create barriers for vulnerable populations. Maya's pilot program focused on 3 hospitals serving predominantly immigrant and low-income populations. She hired multilingual patient advocates with graduate degrees, stationed them in emergency departments, and empowered them to intervene when patients received differential treatment based on insurance status or language barriers. More importantly, they could escalate concerns directly to hospital administration with legal backing from Hiroshi's foundation. Maya also implemented data collection tracking patient satisfaction, treatment times, and outcomes across demographics. The numbers revealed what advocates had long known but couldn't prove. Patients with limited English waited 40% longer. For pain medication, uninsured patients were discharged 12 hours earlier than insured patients with identical conditions, and families in shared rooms received significantly less communication about treatment plans. The results exceeded projections. Within 4 months, the pilot hospitals reduced pain management disparities by 60%, increased satisfaction scores among non-English speakers by 45%, and decreased readmission rates by 20% across all demographics. The hospitals began implementing lasting policy changes, standardized interpreter protocols, mandatory bias training, and ombudsman programs, giving patients formal channels to address discrimination. Hiroshi entered, carrying coffee, wearing the simple, well-made clothes Maya had learned to recognize as the uniform of people wealthy enough to avoid displaying wealth. The board meeting went well, he said. The Tanaka Foundation has approved $50 million for the Miguel Rodriguez Institute for Healthcare Advocacy. The first facility will be here in New York, with satellites in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston within 3 years. Hiroshi, Maya said carefully, I need to ask something that's been troubling me. Why me? You could have hired anyone with more experience managing large organizations, people with healthcare policy connections, people who understand philanthropy better than I do. Why choose someone you met by accident? Hiroshi was quiet, looking at the skyline. Maya-san, it was not an accident. I had been looking for Miguel Rodriguez's family for 20 years. I knew he had a granddaughter who graduated from Columbia with a social work degree, who was working in food service to pay loans, who volunteered with immigrant organizations. I knew she embodied the same values that made her grandfather willing to risk his safety to help a stranger. Maya felt the room shift. You knew who I was when you fell outside the restaurant. Hiroshi nodded. I knew who you were, but I did not know who you would choose to be when faced with a situation requiring moral courage. Many people have good intentions when the cost is low. I needed to know that Miguel Rodriguez's granddaughter had inherited not just his values, but his willingness to act regardless of personal consequences. But the injury that was real. Hiroshi touched the small scar on his forehead. The fall was real. The discrimination at the hospital was real. I had planned to approach you during your shift, but the storm made the sidewalk slippery. What happened after your decision to help your advocacy? Your willingness to risk everything, those choices were entirely your own. You're asking me to run a $50 million foundation based on a single night of decisions I made without knowing I was being evaluated. Hiroshi smiled. I am asking you to run this foundation because of how you made those decisions. Anyone can perform compassion when they know important people are watching. You demonstrated genuine care when you thought no one would ever know. The Miguel Rodriguez Institute will be independent of my oversight, Hiroshi continued. You'll report to a board of healthcare advocates and patient rights attorneys, but operations and strategy will be under your authority. This is not charity, this is investment in institutional change that will outlast both of us. 2 years later, Maya stood in the lobby of the Miguel Rodriguez Institute for Healthcare Advocacy watching patient advocates prepare for another day. The converted warehouse in Long Island City housed the most comprehensive healthcare equity program in the United States. Maya had chosen an open floor plan allowing collaboration across cases and languages with conference rooms named after healthcare heroes from different cultures and a library containing advocacy resources in 15 languages. The Institute employed 47 advocates working in 12 hospitals across New York with programs launching in Chicago and Los Angeles. Maya hired carefully prioritizing candidates combining clinical expertise with lived experience of healthcare discrimination. The advocates had legal authority. Maya had negotiated with hospitals and state departments. They could request immediate physician consultations for delayed patients, demand interpreter services, and initiate formal complaints triggering mandatory review. Results were transformative. Emergency department pain management disparities dropped 78%, readmissions among non-English speakers fell 42%, and satisfaction scores increased 35% among underserved populations. The Institute documented $8 million in annual cost savings through reduced readmissions and improved compliance numbers, convincing executives that equity was financially beneficial, not just morally necessary. Maya had learned that sustainable advocacy required political sophistication her training hadn't addressed. She spent hours with hospital boards, insurance executives, and legislators translating moral arguments into languages different stakeholders understood. Healthcare executives responded to liability data. Insurance companies needed cost savings evidence. Legislators wanted constituent stories demonstrating political benefits of supporting equity initiatives. The morning briefing began at 8:30 with advocates sharing cases requiring intervention. Carmen Delgado described Mount Sinai requiring additional documentation from undocumented immigrants before non-emergency care. It's creating a chilling effect where people avoid necessary care fearing immigration enforcement, Carmen explained. Maya scheduled a meeting with Mount Sinai's legal department to clarify that advocacy protocols applied regardless of immigration status. Maya's office overlooked the East River toward Manhattan. She had chosen this Queen's perspective deliberately, wanting to see the city from where healthcare decisions' consequences were felt rather than where they were made. On her desk sat Miguel's photograph and the watch Hiroshi had returned not as a gift but inheritance, a reminder of values passed through generations. Afternoons brought Maya's favorite work, direct patient consultations, applying clinical training while gathering policy information. Today involved an elderly Dominican woman whose family was pressured to accept inadequate discharge planning. Maya spent an hour helping them understand options and rights, translating medical terminology and strategizing for the next hospital meeting. This intersection of individual care and systemic change reminded Maya why she became a social worker. As evening fell, Maya watched lights come on across the city. She thought about Miguel, who died before meeting Hiroshi and never knew his decision to help a young immigrant would create an institution dedicated to values he'd tried passing down. This was legacy, not individual recognition, but moral choices rippling forward through generations in patterns too complex to track. Her phone buzzed with Hiroshi's text, Board meeting next week for Houston expansion. Your grandmother would be proud. Maya smiled, thinking about the woman who helped nurse a stranger in 1973, never imagining her kindness would touch thousands of lives. The institute was a promise kept across 50 years, demonstrating that individual compassion could become institutional justice. Maya headed home to Astoria, the same neighborhood where her grandparents first settled. She walked past familiar places, the Bodega Community Center Elementary School, where she learned success meant creating opportunities for others. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new chances to demonstrate healthcare as human right rather than privilege. The city hummed with people finishing meaningful work, and Maya felt deep satisfaction knowing her grandfather's legacy continued actively. Kindness had indeed seen no borders, crossing generations, cultures, and institutions to create something outlasting individual contribution. This was exactly the story Miguel would have wanted: success measured not by personal achievement, but by what you made possible for those who came after. If you've ever wondered whether small acts of kindness matter, whether standing up for overlooked people makes a difference, this story is your answer. The next time you see someone needing help, someone the system has ignored, remember, you might be planting seeds for a forest, sheltering generations you'll never meet. What would you have done outside that restaurant? What will you do when your moment comes? Share this story with someone who needs to believe individual compassion can become institutional change.